The afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow over the bustling neighborhood as Elizabeth Carter strolled down the street, clutching her worn leather handbag. At 68 years old, Elizabeth carried herself with grace and dignity. Her silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly as she greeted neighbors with a kind smile. Around her neck, she wore a simple yet precious gold chain, a gift from her late husband James. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a memory, a connection to a love that had weathered decades. As she approached the small boutique where she'd often shopped, her peaceful walk was abruptly interrupted. A police cruiser rolled to a slow stop beside her, the sirens silent, but the weight of authority unmistakable. Officer Ryan Matthews stepped out, his boots striking the pavement with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Tall and imposing, his piercing gaze locked onto Elizabeth, narrowing as if he had already passed judgment. "Excuse me, ma'am," Matthews said, his tone curt. "Can I have a word with you?" Elizabeth turned, startled but calm. "Of course, officer. Is something wrong?" Matthews stepped closer, his hand resting casually on the belt where his holstered weapon sat. "We've had reports of a suspicious person in the area," he said, his voice cold. "I'm going to need to see what's in your bag." Elizabeth blinked, confusion clouding her warm brown eyes. "Suspicious. I'm just heading to the boutique," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "What's this about?" Matthews didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and snatched the bag from her hands, ignoring her protests. "Just a routine check," he muttered, rummaging through her personal belongings on the sidewalk as passers-by slowed to watch. The humiliation was swift and searing. Elizabeth felt her chest tighten as she stood frozen, unsure of what to do or say. Then Matthew's gaze fell on her gold chain. His expression shifted, interest mingled with something darker. "Where'd you get this?" he demanded, pointing to the chain with a nod. Elizabeth's hand instinctively rose to her throat, shielding the precious heirloom. "This was a gift from my husband," she said firmly, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "It's mine." Matthews scoffed, his lip curling. "We'll see about that." Before she could respond, he reached out and yanked the chain from her neck, the clasp snapping with a sharp, cruel sound. Elizabeth gasped, her hand flying to the now bare skin as tears welled in her eyes. Around them, murmurs of shock rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. "Officer, please," Elizabeth pleaded, her composure cracking. "That chain is all I have left of my husband. You can't just take it." But Matthews was already walking back to his cruiser, the chain dangling from his gloved hand. "If you've got nothing to hide, you'll get it back," he said dismissively, climbing into the car and driving away without another word. Elizabeth stood there, her world spinning. The weight of injustice pressed down on her chest, the gold chain's absence a painful void. A young woman from the crowd approached hesitantly, her phone in hand. "Ma'am, are you okay?" she asked softly. "I recorded everything. That was wrong, so wrong." Tears slid down Elizabeth's cheeks as she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know what to do. But someone has to stop him." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Later that evening, Nathan Carter, Elizabeth's son, sat in his modest apartment, reviewing case files for his job at the Department of Justice. At 35, Nathan had dedicated his life to fighting systemic injustice, fueled by the stories his mother had shared of her struggles as a black woman in America. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling his attention away. It was a text from his mother, accompanied by a video. Nathan watched in growing disbelief as the footage unfolded, showing Officer Matthews ripping the gold chain from his mother's neck. His hands clenched into fists, and his jaw tightened. By the time the video ended, his heart pounded with a mix of rage and determination. "This isn't happening," he muttered, his voice low but firm. "Not to my mother." Nathan wasted no time. He called his mother, his voice filled with urgency and care. "Mom, are you okay? I just saw the video." Elizabeth's voice was steady but wary. "I'm fine, Nathan, just shaken. I don't know what to do." "You don't have to do anything," Nathan replied, his resolve clear. "I'm handling this. He's not getting away with it." As Nathan hung up, his mind raced. This wasn't just about one officer's abuse of power. It was about a system that allowed people like Matthews to act without fear of consequences. Nathan knew he would need more than his own determination to bring Matthews to justice. He needed evidence, witnesses, and the community's support. Sitting in the dimly lit room, Nathan began to formulate a plan, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he pulled up case records and connected with colleagues. But deep down, he understood the fight ahead would be uphill. Matthews wasn't just a rogue cop. He was part of a system designed to protect people like him. As the night stretched on, Nathan couldn't shake the image of his mother's tear-streaked face or the sound of the chain snapping. This was personal. And for Matthews, it was about to become a battle he could no longer ignore. What Nathan didn't realize was that this fight would soon grow beyond his mother's case, igniting a reckoning that would shake the community to its core. The streets were quiet when Nathan pulled his hoodie over his head and stepped out into the crisp evening air. His mind buzzed with questions, each one louder than the last. Who was Officer Matthews? How often had he abused his badge this way? And why did he feel bold enough to target someone as harmless as his mother? Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't an isolated incident. It couldn't be. As he walked, his phone vibrated again. It was the young woman who had filmed the encounter with Matthews. Her name was Tasha, and she had found Nathan's contact through a mutual friend after recognizing his mother. Nathan appreciated her willingness to come forward. Witnesses were often reluctant, too afraid of retaliation or too skeptical of justice. Tasha, however, had a fire in her voice that matched Nathan's determination. "Hey, I've got the original video and some extra footage from after he left," she said when he answered. "I wanted to send it to you directly, just in case. People need to see this." Nathan nodded, his breath visible in the cold air. "Thank you, Tasha. This means a lot. My mom, she doesn't deserve this." "No one does," she replied. "And that cop. He's done stuff like this before. I've heard stories, but no one ever has proof. Until now." Her words hit Nathan like a punch to the gut. If Matthews had a history of misconduct, it only made his mother's case more urgent. Nathan promised to stay in touch before hanging up and quickened his pace, heading toward a local community center where he hoped to dig up more information. The center was a modest building with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that read Asterisk Unity. All asterisk inside, the atmosphere was warm but subdued, with a few people chatting over coffee or huddled in small groups. Nathan approached an older man seated near the bulletin board, someone he recognized from community events. "Mr. Lewis," Nathan greeted, his tone respectful. "Do you have a minute?" The man looked up from his cup of tea, his face creased with age and wisdom. "Nathan, isn't it?" "Of course. What brings you here this late?" Nathan explained the situation briefly, careful to keep his emotions in check. Mr. Lewis listened intently, his expression darkening with each word. "I've heard of that Matthews," he said finally, shaking his head. "He's been patrolling this area for years, and let me tell you, he's not exactly beloved. But proving anything against him, that's a whole different story. Folks are scared to speak up." Nathan's stomach churned. "Why? What's he done?" Mr. Lewis sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Intimidation, mostly. Harassing people for no reason, making threats, planting doubt. And if someone pushes back, suddenly they're in even bigger trouble. He knows how to use the system to his advantage." The weight of Mr. Lewis's words settled heavily on Nathan's shoulders. It was a pattern he had seen before, a tactic as old as the very institutions Matthews served. Abuse of power wasn't just about what someone did, it was about the silence they created around them. "Do you think people would be willing to talk if they felt safe?" Nathan asked, a flicker of hope in his voice. Mr. Lewis hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Maybe, but they'd need to know it wouldn't come back to bite them. And you'd need to be careful too. Men like Matthews don't take kindly to being exposed." Nathan thanked him and left the center, his mind racing. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about his mother's gold chain. This was about a community under siege, a neighborhood forced to endure the unchecked power of someone who was supposed to protect them. Back at his apartment, Nathan spread out his notes and began connecting the dots. He created a timeline of incidents based on what little information he had and cross-referenced it with public records. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Then he turned his attention to the video Tasha had sent, analyzing every detail. The way Matthews carried himself, the way he dismissed Elizabeth's protests, the way he seemed utterly unfazed by the growing crowd. It was the behavior of someone who believed he was untouchable. As the hours ticked by, Nathan's focus deepened. He reached out to colleagues at the Department of Justice, carefully framing his questions without revealing too much. He also called a friend who worked in local journalism, hoping to gauge whether the story would gain traction in the media. But no matter how many avenues he explored, one thing remained certain. Matthews was a dangerous man, and confronting him wouldn't be easy. The next day, Nathan visited his mother. Elizabeth greeted him with a hug, her warmth undiminished despite the strain of the past 24 hours. They sat in the cozy living room of her small house, surrounded by framed photos and mementos of a life well lived. "Nathan, you don't have to do all this," she said gently, her hands resting on his. "I don't want you to get yourself in trouble because of me." "It's not just about you, Mom," Nathan replied, his voice steady. "It's about everyone he's hurt. And it's about making sure he doesn't do this to anyone else." Elizabeth studied her son, pride mingling with worry in her eyes. "Just promise me you'll be careful," she said softly. "The world doesn't always play fair, especially for people like us." Nathan nodded, the weight of her words settling over him like a blanket. He knew the risks, but he also knew he couldn't back down. Too much was at stake. As he left his mother's house, Nathan noticed a police cruiser parked a few blocks away. It wasn't Matthews, but the sight of it still made his skin crawl. He couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on him, watching, waiting. It was a reminder that the fight ahead wouldn't just be a battle of facts and evidence. It would be a battle of endurance, a standing firm in the face of fear. Nathan took a deep breath and kept walking, his resolve unwavering. Matthews might have thought he could act without consequence, but he was about to learn the hard way that some lines couldn't be crossed, not without sparking a fire that would burn brighter than he ever anticipated. Nathan's steps grew slower as he neared his apartment, his mind tangled in a web of questions and unease. The faint hum of the city around him did little to drown out the pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the image of Matthews towering over his mother, nor the unspoken pain in her eyes when she handed over that cherished gold chain. It wasn't just about the jewelry, it was about dignity, about respect, about the countless times people, like his mother, were dismissed, demeaned, or ignored. Later that night, Nathan sat in the dim light of his apartment, staring at his laptop. He had pulled up the footage Tasha had sent again, pausing and rewinding at key moments. Matthew's expression was what struck him most. There wasn't a hint of hesitation or remorse in his demeanor, only confidence, maybe even arrogance. It was the look of someone who knew they could get away with it. Nathan leaned back, his mind circling the same question. Asterisk how many others had been on the receiving end of this man's unchecked authority. Asterisk, he decided to reach out to the community, starting with an anonymous post in a local forum, asking if anyone had had similar experiences. Within hours, the thread began to gain traction. Stories poured in, people recounting incidents of harassment, intimidation, and humiliation, all tied to Officer Matthews. One comment stood out. A user claimed to have worked as a clerk in the precinct where Matthews was assigned. "The guy's a bully in uniform," they wrote, "but he's got friends in high places, which is why nothing sticks. Watch your back if you're planning to go after him." Nathan's stomach tightened as he read the words. This wasn't just about a corrupt cop. This was about a system that protected him, that enabled him to operate with impunity. Nathan knew he was stepping into dangerous territory, but the thought of backing down never crossed his mind. The next day, Nathan decided to meet Tasha in person. They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe tucked away in a corner of the neighborhood. Tasha was younger than Nathan expected, probably in her early 20s, but there was a maturity in her gaze that belied her age. She slid a flash drive across the table, her expression serious. "I've got some more stuff on there," she said. "After he left your mom, he had another stop a few blocks away. Same attitude, same everything. I followed him for a bit, just to see what he was up to." Nathan nodded, pocketing the drive. "You're brave for doing this," he said. "Most people wouldn't." Tasha shrugged. "I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. People like him, they count on us being too scared or too tired to fight back. But I'm tired of being tired, you know." Nathan did know. Her words echoed his own thoughts, the quiet frustration that had simmered in him for years. They spent the next hour sharing stories, strategizing, and mapping out their next steps. Tasha agreed to help spread the word, using her social media platforms to amplify the stories they were collecting. As the days passed, Nathan's apartment began to feel more like a war room. Notes and photos were pinned to the walls, creating a sprawling network of connections. Each new piece of information painted a clearer picture of Matthew's pattern of behavior, but it also revealed how deeply entrenched the problem was. Complaints had been filed, investigations had been opened, but nothing had ever come of it. Matthews was protected, insulated by a culture of silence and complicity. One evening, Nathan received a call from his friend in journalism, a reporter named Sam. "I've been digging into Matthews," Sam said. "There's a paper trail, but it's thin. He's smart enough to keep most of his dirt off the record. If you want to take him down, you'll need something concrete, something undeniable." Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We're working on it," he said. "But the more I learn, the bigger this thing gets. It's not just about him, it's about the whole system." Sam's voice softened. "That's the uphill battle, my friend. The system protects its own. But if you can find that one crack, that one weak spot, sometimes that's all it takes." Nathan thanked him and hung up, his resolve hardening. He knew Sam was right. He needed something that couldn't be ignored, something that would force even the most reluctant officials to act. But as Nathan's investigation gained momentum, so did the pushback. He started noticing unfamiliar cars parked near his apartment, saw figures lingering just a little too long on the street. One evening, as he walked home, he felt the unmistakable sensation of being followed. He ducked into an alley, his pulse racing, but when he turned to look, the street was empty. The message was clear. Someone wanted him to stop. But instead of fear, the incident only fueled Nathan's determination. If Matthews, or whoever was protecting him, thought they could intimidate him into silence, they were in for a rude awakening. Nathan wasn't just fighting for his mother anymore. He was fighting for Tasha, for the people who had shared their stories, for every person who had ever been told to stay silent. He was fighting for a neighborhood that deserved better, for a community that had endured too much for too long. And he wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. Nathan's nerves were stretched thin, but his determination burned brighter. The flash drive Tasha had given him proved to be a goldmine. It contained more than just footage. There were audio snippets, shaky but clear enough to capture Matthew's voice issuing threats and belittling his victims. There was even a partial recording from someone brave enough to document their interaction with Matthews, showing his blatant disregard for any form of accountability. Nathan knew this was powerful evidence, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Tasha was relentless in her efforts, rallying more voices from the community. They'd organized a small meeting at a local church one evening, a safe space where people could come forward and share their stories. The turnout surprised Nathan. Dozens of people showed up, from young adults to elderly residents, each with their own encounter involving Matthews. Some were hesitant to speak at first, but as the stories began to flow, so did their courage. An older man stood, his hands trembling as he gripped the pew in front of him. "He came into my shop once," the man said, his voice quivering. "Said I wasn't complying with some zoning law. Tried to shut me down right there. When I told him I'd file an appeal, he smirked. Said I wouldn't like what happened if I did." A young woman followed, recounting how Matthews had pulled her over late at night. "He kept me there for an hour," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Said I looked suspicious. All I'd done was drive home from work. Nathan listened, taking notes, his heart aching for each person who spoke. The room was filled with a shared frustration, but also a growing sense of solidarity. For so long, they had been isolated in their experiences, but now they were finding strength in numbers. Still, Nathan couldn't ignore the undercurrent of fear in the room. Matthews wasn't just a bad cop. He was a symbol of something bigger, a system that had let him thrive. Later that night, as Nathan reviewed his notes, his phone buzzed with a text from Tasha. Got a lead, it read. Check this out. She sent him a link to an obscure blog post detailing a civil case that had been quietly settled years ago. The case involved a young man who claimed Matthews had used excessive force during an arrest. The man had suffered permanent injuries, but had signed a non-disclosure agreement as part of the settlement. Nathan's mind raced. If he could find this man, he might uncover more evidence to expose Matthews' pattern of abuse. He reached out to the reporter Sam, who promised to dig into the settlement and see if there was any way around the NDA. The next day, Tasha and Nathan visited the neighborhood where the man had reportedly lived. It was a long shot, but they hoped someone might know where he had gone. After hours of knocking on doors and asking questions, they'd finally found an old neighbor who remembered him. He moved out of state, the woman said, but I think his sister still lives a few blocks over. They tracked down the sister, a quiet woman named Deidre, who confirmed her brother's story but was hesitant to say much more. He doesn't like talking about it, she said. It ruined his life. He just wants to move on. Nathan understood her reluctance but couldn't let it go. Please, he said gently. If you can't speak, maybe you can. We're trying to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Your story could help. Deidre hesitated, then nodded. I'll talk to him, she said. But no promises. As Nathan and Tasha left her house, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her car idled at the end of the block, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. Nathan's instincts screamed at him to stay alert, but he played it cool, walking casually back to their own vehicle. Once inside, he turned to Tasha. Did you see that? He asked. Yeah, she replied, her voice low. We're being followed. They drove off, taking a circuitous route through the city, making random turns and doubling back. The car followed them for several blocks before peeling off, but the message was clear. Whoever was protecting Matthews wasn't going to let them dig any deeper without consequences. Nathan's phone rang later that night. It was his mother. Are you okay, baby? She asked, her voice laced with worry. I heard from Mrs. Harris down the street. She said someone's been asking questions about us. Nathan's heart sank. His investigation was putting her at risk, something he had vowed never to do. I'm fine, Ma, he said, trying to sound reassuring. Just be careful, okay? Don't talk to anyone you don't know. As he hung up, the weight of his decision settled on him. He was fighting for justice, but at what cost? His mother, Tasha, and everyone who had come forward were now in the crosshairs. The stakes had never been higher, and the line between courage and recklessness had never felt thinner. Nathan knew one thing for certain. He couldn't back down now. Not when they were so close to exposing the truth. The question was, how far would Matthews, and the system that protected him, go to keep their secrets hidden? The air in Nathan's small apartment was thick with tension as he sat at his desk, poring over the evidence collected so far. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the threads that could expose Matthews once and for all, but the nagging feeling of being watched lingered. The encounter with the car that had followed them earlier wasn't just paranoia. It was a warning. Someone was trying to send a message, but Nathan wasn't about to let fear silence him. The next morning, as he stepped out to grab coffee, he noticed something unusual. A small envelope was taped to his door, the edges slightly damp from the morning dew. Nathan glanced around the hallway, but it was empty. He peeled the envelope off carefully and opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper. Typed in bold, black letters were the words, Drop 8. You don't, and then over to YouTube. Nathan's stomach churned, but he folded the note and slipped it into his pocket, refusing to let the threat rattle him. Instead, he met Tasha later that day at her diner. The usual warmth in her smile was missing as she slid into the booth across from him. She leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone broke into my place last night. It didn't take anything, just messed stuff up. Left everything in a pile on my bed." Nathan's jaw tightened. "They're trying to scare us." "Well, it's working," Tasha admitted, her eyes darting around the room. "But it's not going to stop me." Nathan nodded, drawing strength from her resolve. "We need to move fast. The longer this drags on, the more vulnerable we are." Their conversation was interrupted by a buzz from Nathan's phone. It was a text from Sam. "You need to see this. Check your email." Nathan quickly opened his laptop and clicked on the link Sam had sent. It was a scanned copy of an old internal memo from the police department, flagged as confidential. The memo detailed complaints filed against Matthews over the years, including some that had mysteriously disappeared from official records. Even more alarming, it hinted at a connection between Matthews and a prominent local politician. Nathan's pulse quickened as he read the memo. This wasn't just about one rogue cop. Matthews was a pawn in a much larger game, and the people pulling the strings had deep pockets and powerful connections. The stakes were higher than Nathan had ever imagined. That evening, Nathan and Tasha met with Sam in a dimly lit parking garage, a spot chosen for its privacy. Sam handed over a flash drive containing more documents he had uncovered, his face grave. "This is bigger than I thought," he said. "Matthews isn't just protected by the department. He's got ties to a network that's been profiting off these settlements. They're paying people off to stay quiet and covering up cases that could blow the whole thing wide open." Nathan felt a mix of anger and determination. "So Matthews is just the tip of the iceberg." "Exactly," Sam replied. "But exposing this won't be easy. The people involved won't go down without a fight." As they parted ways, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. He and Tasha reviewed the new evidence late into the night, piecing together a timeline of corruption that spanned years. But just as they began to see the full picture, another twist caught them off guard. A knock at the door startled them both. Nathan peered through the peephole and saw Deidre standing there, her expression panicked. He opened the door and she rushed inside, clutching a small box. "I shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "But my brother, he gave me this before he left. Said if anything ever happened to him, I should find someone I could trust." Nathan opened the box carefully, revealing a collection of photographs, letters, and even an old cassette tape. It was evidence of Matthew's activities, things he had done off the clock, under the radar. But one photograph stood out. It showed Matthews shaking hands with a man Nathan recognized immediately, the same local politician implicated in Sam's memo. "This is it," Tasha whispered, her eyes wide. "This is the proof we need." But before they could celebrate, Nathan's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from his mother. Her voice was shaky, filled with fear. "Nathan, there are men outside the house. They're parked across the street watching." Nathan's blood ran cold. "Stay inside, Ma. Lock the doors. I'm coming." Tasha grabbed his arm as he started to leave. "You can't go alone. It's too dangerous." "I don't have a choice," Nathan replied, his voice firm. "They're targeting my family now. That's where I draw the line." The tension had reached a boiling point, and Nathan knew the clock was ticking. Whoever was behind this was no longer just trying to intimidate, they were escalating. The question now was how far they were willing to go to keep their secrets buried.